This week, the Grand Canyon is so breathtaking, so gorgeous, that we just can't stand it any longer. Here's a list of all the plans to destroy this pristine beauty and what you can do to stop it. Next up, Monsanto is poisoning people, and that's nothing new. But after 4 decades, one measly clause in a House bill could wipe their legal slate clean. And finally, Daniel Lee has occupied the streets, organized and appeared at rallies and actions for years. Now he's taking that fight into a bid for political office. But first, an ode to a stoic beauty. A line of cars on black lung bars, cut with yellow stripes, snake along through stoic lands. A cigarette in listless hands flicks the ash as gas fumes lash out at pristine skies that last. Long enough for photo ops and hashtag nature rocks. The rocks ahead, majestic spires carelessly admired. Carve the sky a common dry, easy strength and airy depth, grounded wise yet still aloof. Detached from each new mass of men arriving here to pass the time with selfie sticks and sunburned smiles. Here today, gone the next. What I liked about it best is how it's so free, unkempt. Trailheads clearly marked, and then well-kept roads that keep the native out. Like Disneyland, a slow and soothing route, a ranger dressed like Indiana waves us in as this long snake coughs and slithers on. The rev of engines, clouds of dust, settle on a faded sign that must not have seen the sick and twisted irony that to these SUVs decreed, please don't litter. Leave nothing but your footprints, take nothing but your memories, a pointing pressed to rolled up windows, AC blasting, passing by but not adapting. This is untouched nature captive. This is where our conscience goes to pasture, to ruminate and masticate, to chew the cud of upchucked lies, a feeble old defense of times that place these arbitrary lines, charging people nature-loving tithes to see the sights that otherwise would fall to grotesque, crooked minds. No, here is safe, for now. But just outside, the for sale signs that slowly creep like soldiers in the desert heat, hoping for an inch, a pinch of dirt to add to growing piles, a notch that marks an extra mile, a sunburned, careless smile. Capitalistic, proudly sadistic, a businessman who measures miles, a handshake over promised land, an amputated beauty bleeds into the sand. Come one, come all, to a nature-themed shopping mall, a dirty neon fall from grace, the race to fill the space with something worth what we decided is our worth as people, planet, measured, cut, treasures only worth as much as they can make when used and raped, protectors of this place, bought and sold. Those for sale signs still creeping close. A kid then whines that hiking sucks, where's my phone? Take a picture, frame it, mark it done, and then head home. What happens here will soon echo, as cars that lined those black long bars take a memory and leave, a nature made for visits brief, a scenery that won't compete with industry and man's belief that this is what we own, the strongest beasts upon our throne, this is what we're owed. The sand, the sky, and the rocks that in those rounded, jagged interruptions tie. The sun, the sand, the rocks, and sky bind them to each other like infants on the breast of mothers, sculpt a landscape of both beauty and power. Impossible, implausible trees reach their spiked and gnarly limbs towards this unforgiving sun, as if to celebrate their thirst and drink the hot, dry air, dancing with the wind that kicks the sand in rhythmic swirls till darkness covers day and moonlit scenes unfurl. Because we can, because this sand will hold the lines that mark what's yours and what is not is mine, because the rocks don't protest and the trees don't hold their branches up against our toxic creed, because we, driving by on black long bars and sealed up, cooled off cars, stay quiet. Before a looming giant, a system built to ruin, a system built to ruin, a ruined space, an amputated beauty placed, a sacrifice to gods we made in order to relate, a story of our unique glory, above all else indeed, above the sky, the sand, the sun, and even air we breathe, yet we, some of us, can lift our arms, our branches, protest for the sake of those who speak but are not heard, the rocks, the sand, the sun, and sky. Why we remain the quiet souls, the silent minds that take this ride, yet never step outside to stand in awe of what we could be part of, instead of killing all, ourselves, each other, just to draw that simple line and mark what's yours and what is not is mine. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. So now that I've waxed poetic, slightly depressingly, about our land, our shallow appreciation of nature, let me turn to prose on the front lines. The Grand Canyon. Breathtaking. Powerful, impressive, inspiring, awesome in the true meaning of that word. It's one of those natural wonders that seems so obviously placed under the protection of a national park and monument, even to expansionist Teddy Roosevelt, who had this to say when he visited the site a few years before he made it a national monument. Let this great wonder of nature remain as it now is. Do nothing to mar its grandeur, sublimity, and loveliness. You cannot improve on it. But believe it or not, there's more than one plan to not so much improve on the Grand Canyon, but to make it more economically useful because, for fuck's sake, it's really just sitting there, barely making any money off of park fees and a few souvenir keychains. It's time that we put it to work. So what if we built a giant fucking compound of stores and hotels right next to it? This is the idea behind the proposed Grand Canyon Escalade project, which, yes, does indeed sound like an even douchier version of the regular Escalade, if that's even possible. This plan seeks to build what amounts to a small city along the rim of the canyon, including a hotel, motels, restaurants, retail stores, studios, and galleries, an RV park, visitor center, museum, and an aerial tram to carry visitors from the canyon rim down to the Colorado River, where there will be another restaurant, just in case they got kind of famished on their ride down the fucking tram. Also, on the banks of the old Colorado, there would be another gift shop, an amphitheater, an elevated walkway. Welcome to pristine nature, everyone. So, what's wrong with this plan? Obviously, the most glaring issue is, of course, the environment. Not just the eyesore issue, the disgusting display of a fucking gap right in the middle of a natural wonder. Not just that, but the impact of roughly 3 million tourists a year in a fragile ecosystem like the Grand Canyon. That's not something that can just be glossed over. And on top of the issue of finding water for that extra 3 million people a year in a place that is experiencing the worst drought in over 100 years, there's apparently no mention of sewage treatment in the agreement with the Navajo Nation. They're the owners of the land in the proposed development area. So, we are talking about somewhere around 10,000 people a day, eating, drinking, showering, pissing, and shitting, and I guess we'll just cross that bridge over a river of shit when we get there. And speaking of which, there is also the issue of the Navajo Nation. So a little backstory here. In 1966, Robert L. Bennett, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, put a freeze on any development or even improvement to roughly 1 million acres of land due to a dispute of ownership between the Hopi and Navajo nations. Over the course of the next 40 years, while the lawsuit between Hopi and Navajo tribes lodged itself in the courts like a giant turd in a drain with no sewage plan, those living on the disputed lands endured tremendous social and economic hardships due to the freeze. Homes fell into disrepair as quote-unquote improvements, like running water and electricity, were prohibited. Jobs were scarce at best, and everything from education to healthcare to social services and infrastructure repairs to things like roads and bridges were effectively non-existent. In 2006, a court approved a settlement between the tribes and awarded most of the land back to the Navajo. And in 2009, Obama officially repealed the freeze, and his repeal allowed for the Navajo to begin developing and improving their lands. Enter the Escalade Project. When Lamar Whitmer of Fulcrum Group and Confluence Partners LLC approached the Navajo Nation with this proposal, he knew exactly how to make the sell. Jobs, money, stability. For people who have been suffering under 40 years of joblessness and economic instability, roughly 2,000 jobs sounds pretty fucking good. And not even opponents to the plan will argue that point. Here is what they do argue. Hardly any of that money made off of this fucking monstrosity will go to the community it promises to help. Details from the agreement between Confluence and the Navajo Nation show that a maximum of 18% of revenue is earmarked for the Navajo, and that's if attendance stays above 2 million. If attendance drops below 800,000 people, the Navajo get a whopping 8% of revenue. So this is basically that freeze I mentioned in slightly less frigid form. As Renee Yellowhorse, Navajo and member of Save the Confluence said, which is an organization that's fighting the development, she said there would be a few well-paying jobs, but most of the profits would go right back to the developers in Scottsdale. They come in with their empty promises, dividing the people. It hurts me very much. She goes on to remark on the importance of the land outside the obvious colonial appreciation for nature. This is where our spirits go back to. My father passed away last March. That's where he resides. This is where the tram would go. This is the heart of our Mother Earth. This is a sacred area, and we do not want to see the site desecrated. The specific area she's speaking of is the confluence, where the Little Colorado River and the Colorado River meet. For the Navajo, this intersection represents the coming together of male and female, the beginning of life. As of now, the development is still under dispute. Opponents like Renee Yellowhorse, Save the Confluence, and the Grand Canyon Trust are all pushing for culturally driven, locally based alternative economic development initiatives, aka shit that doesn't include shopping malls, trams, hotels, motels, and irreversible environmental destruction. You can learn more about this work and join the fight to save the Grand Canyon at savetheconfluence.com and grandcanyontrust.org. Now, before we move on, let me just quickly dive into one more issue threatening the Grand Canyon. You may recall from episode 48 that radiation is pluming up from abandoned uranium mines all across the western United States. And in some cases, that radiation is many times worse than the red evac zones around Fukushima. And that's fucking nuts. As is the fact that there's no accountability or federal push to clean up these leaking death pits. What is also nuts, however, is that there is now a push to open up new uranium mines around the Grand Canyon. That's new mines, by the way, on top of existing mines. A little backstory here as well, stay with me. There's already been uranium mining around the Grand Canyon for decades. In fact, an article written last year by Mark Udall, board member of the Grand Canyon Trust and former Colorado senator, he noted that mining has already polluted 15 springs and 5 wells within the Grand Canyon's watershed with toxic levels of uranium. He goes on to list uranium spills, poisoned groundwater, creeks, and tributaries that, much like our story from episode 48, come with irreversible damage to people and planet, exacerbated by the total lack of corporate accountability. Now, activists have been fighting against these mining interests around the Grand Canyon for years. And just last week, Carletta Toulouse of the Havasupai tribe traveled to D.C. to deliver more than 50,000 signatures urging Obama to permanently ban uranium mining around the Grand Canyon by extending the National Monument designation to the surrounding areas just outside the park. As usual, this is about corporate money versus people and planet. And if you watch this show, then you know that I'm far too realistic to think that Obama will just act on behalf of people and planet on his own accord. So whether you're moved by the shopping mall plans or the plumes of death dust, be moved and do something. You can learn more about the issue of uranium mining by again visiting the Grand Canyon Trust or the Center for Biological Diversity. And the Center for Biological Diversity has a long list of other eco-actions that you can lend your voice to. So you can kind of diversify your activism. Jump from the Grand Canyon to Alberta tar sands and back again. And speaking of jumping, before we jump to LA and hear from occupier, amender, activist, and city council member hopeful Daniel Lee, let's jump to a brief Lowlife Scum Award in Alabama and beyond.
You lowlife scum.
Anniston, Alabama, a small town in the northeastern part of the state that sprang up in the 1880s as a quote-unquote model city for the Industrial Revolution. Fast forward 100-some-odd years to 1929, and the trajectory of that model city came to include the manufacturing of the industrial coolant PCBs, polychlorinated biophenols, someone else can correct me on that. In fact, you may have heard of the company that was making them, Monsanto. Yeah, along with Agent Orange and Roundup, Monsanto produced pretty much all of the 1.25 billion pounds of PCBs sold in the US. And much like Agent Orange and Roundup, PCBs have been linked to everything from cancer to autoimmune disorders to the mass die-off of fish and wildlife in contaminated areas. Before last week, this story was just kind of another old corporate malfeasance story stuck in the courts of a paid-off justice system, flanked by dying people and destroyed natural habitats. But last week, a tiny little clause brought this issue into the national spotlight. Before I dig into the present, let's take a quick look at the past so you know what the fuck the context is. Internal memos and indeed their own research show that as soon as 1935, Monsanto was aware that PCBs were harmful to workers in the factory and to the areas around the factory, including the air, the soil, and the water. Take this memo from one of Monsanto's own scientists who tested PCBs on lab animals and fish. The PCBs are exhibiting a greater degree of toxicity than we had anticipated. Doses which were believed to be okay produced 100% kill. So Monsanto did what any self-respecting corporation would do, kept that shit quiet and kept the profits coming. As the Chemical Industry Archives noted in their research on this case, for nearly 40 years, unfiltered and untreated PCB waste was discharged directly into streams or dumped in landfills around town. Monsanto employees also carried the chemical, sold under the brand name Aerochlor, home on their work clothes. And while Monsanto stopped manufacturing PCBs in Anniston in 1971, the plant continued to discharge smaller quantities of PCBs in its waste as a result of continued production of related compounds. Now, fast forward to 2000, the people of Anniston did win a $700 million settlement against Monsanto in order to assist in cleanup and healthcare costs, which sounds like a lot to you and me, but to Monsanto, it's like a fraction of the about $20 billion that they make in an average year. I don't know what fraction that is, but it's a small one. And even still, Monsanto has predictably done all in their power to weasel out of this legal mandate, spending twice as much money on lawyers as they have on cleanup. And this is just the case of Anniston. As the New York Times pointed out, yes, sometimes they do report well. As the New York Times reported last week, Monsanto is currently facing lawsuits from many different directions for many millions of dollars. And here is why Anniston's 40-year battle is suddenly a current news story. Right now, Congress is working to reform the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is in dire need of reform. Even the limp-dick EPA noted that the act is currently so unworkable that as many as 1,000 hazardous chemicals still on sale today need to be evaluated to see if they should be banned or restricted. So yeah, that all sounds like a case of about fucking time. But couched within this bill is a tiny little tidbit that could excuse Monsanto of any liability in the poisoning of people and planet for more than 4 fucking decades. Section 7C. This clause would block PCB lawsuits by state and local governments as well as American citizens. It would also prevent states from passing their own PCB regulations. Sounds like GMO, doesn't it? As John Fisk, one of the lawyers representing the 6 cities suing to collect money from the company to help cover cleanup costs, told the New York Times, taxpayers and public entities would be left holding the bag to pay hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, cleaning up Monsanto's PCBs. Speaking of GMOs, this news, of course, comes at the same time as that roided-up version of the Dark Act makes its way through Congress, and House aides have the fucking gall to suggest that this clause has nothing to do with protecting Monsanto, which is the only company that made PCBs in the U.S. Calling Monsanto low-life scum at this point is basically redundant. But we need to call out the legislators as well. An online petition opposing Clause 7 is already at more than 70,000 signatures. Add your name to it. Call, email, knock on doors, and for fuck's sakes, join the movement against Monsanto. You can go ahead and mark your calendars for May 21st, the International Day to March Against Monsanto. More on that and the movement at march-against-monsanto.com. Now, let's move from low-life scum to a powerful iteration of hope for both people and planet: activists running for office. In a little place called Culver City, in a little place called Los Angeles, an experienced activist is running for office. Last week, Daniel Lee spoke to us about his campaign, the issues facing his city, and the importance of local politics. Take a look. You have been an activist for quite some time now. Why did you decide now to run for city council?
Well, I'd actually been thinking about it for I would say like the last 4 to 7 years. And I've been thinking about it more in the God, I hope somebody else comes along so I don't have to run for office sort of way. But if you pay attention to our national politics, whether it's the Republicans who are becoming a little more outwardly fascist by the day, or the Democrats who even when Reagan was president would probably be considered moderates or conservatives the way they are now. It's pretty clear that we're going in the wrong direction. And I personally know a lot of activists and organizers around the country, and I think a lot of them would just do a much better job. But if no one else is doing it, and only the selfish people who are either looking out for their own self interest or looking out for some other person's business interest do it, then we are, I guess, well, whatever. We're fucked.
Yes, straightforwardly put. Talk a little bit about like the city council vote. I mean, a lot of people are arguing now whether it matters that anybody votes for the president because it's all going to be rigged and yada, yada, yada. Talk a little bit about what that's like on a local level and thereby the importance of local politics.
I think in terms of being disillusioned with politics, that holds true more for national politics than it does for local politics. I think the sad thing is, though, people feel more empowered voting nationally. A lot of people don't know that if they vote locally, they have more effect on their day to day life. And it's not just potholes or, trash pickup. In Culver City, as I said, we're in a very weird position. 10% of the largest urban oil field in the country, the Inglewood oil field, is in Culver City. And the push right now is to get better regulations and setbacks for houses, and so oil derricks and wells have to be so far away. But for me, I think the focus should really be on ending the oil field, transforming it into something else. There's a plan that was on the books 10 years ago to change the Inglewood oil field into a very large park, sort of like Central Park or Griffith Park here in Northeast Los Angeles. Even though I think that's an interesting idea, based on some environmental reports I've read recently, I'd be more in favor of turning the area, which is elevated, I'd be more in favor of converting that to a solar and wind farm. And then maybe over time, as it gets cleaned up, we could turn parts of it into a park, because you can't just go from, oil field into park. There's a lot of cancer and asthma and emphysema and respiratory diseases that will come with that, because there are a lot of people who live on the other side of the oil field that's not in Culver City who've had increased instances of brain cancer and all the other things I just mentioned. So really, we just need to end it. We need to find some alternative. But on the other side of Culver City, it's right on the border of Playa Vista and Culver City. There's a natural gas storage facility which was built at the same time as the storage facility in Porter Ranch, and hasn't been, inspected, at the it's been inspected basically at the same rate as the one in Porter Ranch. So at any moment, we could have a similar environmental disaster here in Culver City. And even just yesterday, UC Irvine released a report around methane hotspots around Los Angeles County, and they are everywhere. It's not just Porter Ranch. But I think we really need to be active both in our transition from fossil fuels into more renewable sources, and in our community refusal to have, fossil fuel facilities in our area.
What would you say to people that say like activism is either this straightforward, no bullshit stuff on the streets, or it's politicians lying and being full of shit in the houses of the powerful? What do you say to somebody who doesn't think that you can combine those two?
I think, like a larger goal for me is, amending the Constitution. And one of the really honest facts about that is, the current Congress is not going to do that for us. And the next Congress is probably not going to do that for us, and probably the next two, Like, so we really need to take some steps if we're serious to replace those people. And part of my idea about running in general is to encourage other people to run. What if we had a whole bunch of people who were honest and straightforward and said, no, I believe everybody should succeed in this society. I believe that we're the richest country in the history of the world, and the fact that we have homeless people at all is disgraceful. Like, I believe that college should be free. I believe that you shouldn't go into debt, because you got sick. These are very, very, very basic things that most people would agree with. But by and large, we hear one or two or three prominent figures saying them. And I feel like if we moved up through the ranks, or, we don't even have to move up, if we just had very passionate elected officials on the local level, we could set the stage for our expectations on a national level. People would know, because of the way we vote locally and because of the local officials that we elect, that if you're not like in line with these guys, then I'm probably not going to vote for you for Senate or Congress or president. And I feel like we cut off our hands when we just stay in the realm of activism and organizing and don't really work the inside outside strategy, because it's very easy to ignore you if you have no power, but you're right.
For more information on Daniel Lee and his campaign, visit danielwaynelee.com. And that does it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. As usual, check out the last slide to see all of the sites that I mentioned in this week's show. And please remember to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out.